Step 2 is what I just showed you before, which is highlighting and annotating. So once I've got my notes, I then like to print them out. I print out physical copies, black and white physical copies of the notes. And my notes will be really, really bland. They'll just be black and white bullet points pretty much, and numbered lists. Then what I do is I go through and, in the vein of condensing, I highlight key words. There are 2 points to note here. One, I highlight keywords so that when I see Italian art, the case there, by highlighting a couple of keywords, those will trigger my memory to be able to reproduce the whole of the rest of that bullet point. So basically what you're doing by highlighting a few keywords is condensing again information down into those keywords so that you can reproduce, basically saying to yourself the whole of that sentence on the basis of just seeing a couple of keywords. Therefore that means that your brain only needs to memorize 2 or 3 keywords in order to have stored away for your essay or whatever answer you might be producing a whole sentence. And that's really the power of highlighting and again, condensing information further and further. So that's highlighting kind of step 1, is to make sure that we're highlighting keywords so that we can condense our memorization of whole sentences into a few keywords. And the second thing is to color code highlighting. So I color code my highlighting by using a kind of pretty simple system. Basically for law now, I'm coloring case names green, key information that kind of really need to remember is in yellow, pink is for facts of cases, and I use blue for statute, kind of numbers and kind of key pieces of statute. And that kind of simple system basically means that, and this is really the key to highlighting, it's very much similar to using a mind map if you're kind of visual, because I don't want people to think that because I have kind of quite a systematic and bullet pointy way of revising that I'm not in any way using kind of visual element of memorization. Basically what color coding is allowing me to do, and the reason why I kind of highlight these key words, is that it allows me to build up somewhat of a picture of each page of my notes. So I can think, oh yeah, case name, then facts, yeah, that's not important, I don't need the fact here because that wasn't highlighted in pink. Oh, then we got a statute number because I can remember there was a bit of blue there. And I basically build up a sort of a picture over time. And I don't always think I've got a photographic memory. It's literally from looking at these notes over and over again over a period of time. And that highlighting really just sticks in my head. So you can see here, hopefully, kind of how few words are highlighted. I would say probably about a third or maybe even a quarter of the page is actually highlighted. And it's really important that you don't over highlight. You really want to pick out those key pieces of information that are going to prompt you to remember other stuff. And as I say, this is akin to using a mind map. For me, it allows me to kind of picture the page. I have my titles, I have my bullet points, I have my highlighting, and that allows me to have these chunks in my mind when we make our notes, and then to memorize those chunks through having kind of key pieces of information in an order, often with numbers. So I remember there are 5 pieces of information here, and I'll have them in that order. I'll have them highlighted, so I'll remember the colors. And all of this is really building up to helping us memorize the information. Then the other thing that should be noted, and this is another kind of really nice technique that I use, I think, is to have little annotations on the sides of my notes as I am going through them. So as I become more familiar with the notes themselves, what I'll do is I'll, rather than kind of just highlighting and leaving the text exactly as it is, I'll think, actually, that idea I hadn't thought of before, but that idea is linked to another idea. And I could potentially in an essay be able to link that chunk of information with another chunk of information. And that's really, really important, is that then I have, again, the visual element of having my written annotated notes on the side of the page, but I'll also be able that much more easily to remember, oh yeah, there was a connection here. I remember I had a little note on the side of my page. There's a connection here to another chunk of information. So when I'm doing my essay plan, potentially it's not relevant, but perhaps it is relevant. And perhaps this little note, I think, oh yeah, that note on, I don't know, image forms of social media, how it connects to YouTube, I don't know, Instagram having video, how that connects to other video forms of social media. I might then be able to interlink those ideas such that I bring in a chunk of information that's a little bit different or a little bit unusual to what everyone else will be using. And that's how I kind of connect ideas within my notes like that. So I have chunks of information, but also then little annotated notes that link those chunks of information, so that when I'm planning an essay or writing some kind of answer, I can have in my mind, actually, where are there connections here that I might be able to make use of. So that's kind of step 2, is the highlighting and annotating phase. Highlighting really happens before I start memorizing the notes properly, but then I'll annotate throughout the course of my revision period as I'm memorizing. And then we come on to step 3, which really is the core of my memorization technique. And I've got to confess, this is a technique that I stole. I was just looking up to see if I had a copy of my book, Rules of Revision. And when I say my book, it's a book that was written by 10 Oxford and Cambridge students that I kind of coordinated to write it. And basically those 10 students, one of them is a good friend of mine who studied law at Cambridge. And she had this technique where she would have notes similar to how I have now, how I've explained it to you, and she would walk around her room and talk to herself. And this wasn't a technique I'd used before she told me about it particularly. I tested myself and used active recall. But this I found was just a really, really effective technique, and it's one that I've used ever since. So basically what I do is I take my revision notes, and again, this technique is really helpful if you're doing an essay-based subject or a subject with a lot of memorization to get through, where you need to know kind of lots of big chunks of information in a particular order that you'll then be able to reproduce, again, mixing the chunks as necessary for the particular essay, but where you need to know big chunks of information in a particular order. Basically what I do is, once I've got my notes written out, condensed, I've then highlighted those keywords, I'll then begin testing myself on everything. And the idea is that hopefully I'm again learning now. I've combined visual in the highlighting and the order. I'm now combining that with auditory learning, and that is through talking to myself. So what I'll do is I'll get a page of the notes. So let's say again that I'll take this Article 30 of the Treaty for the Functioning of the European Union example. Basically this section is kind of a page and a bit. So what I'll do is I'll start off by reading to myself the first paragraph. So this is the Italian art case, customs duty. There's nothing highlighted in yellow in this first paragraph, so I can just remember Article 30. That is kind of defined first of all in Italian art. I know the definition of that, so that's fine. Then I move on, next paragraph, we've got some highlighting in yellow here. Charge is levied by reason of importation. So I just need to remember that phrase. I need to remember that Article 30 will apply when the charge is levied by reason of importation. And that is from the case of Dansk Denkevet. Okay, Dansk Denkevet. Charge is levied by reason of importation by Dansk Denkevet. And you might think I'm saying this out loud because I'm doing a video. I will actually be saying this out loud as I am to you now when I'm memorizing. Now, I've already memorized all of this, so I actually already know this, but then what I would do, once I've got those 2 paragraphs, I would then say, right, okay, so Article 30 definition is first defined in the case of Italian art. I know the definition of Article 30 is charge having equivalent, sorry, I'm having to look now, but having said I know it, charge having equivalent effect on imports, okay, charge having equivalent effect, custom duty or charge having equivalent effect on imports and exports. Article 30, defined in Italian art, purely by reason of importation or exportation. That's from Dansk Denkevet. Okay, so I've just got those 2 paragraphs. I've managed to say them back to myself. Now I'll move on to the next little bit. I'll do the next couple of paragraphs. Again, repeat those to myself without looking. Then I'll combine all of those, let's say 4 or 6 paragraphs, and try and say those through to myself once again. Then I'll move on to the next section, do a couple of paragraphs, and over time I'm building up. Then I would move on to say, try and do, if you can see here, this whole section here, just this whole section, this paragraph, this kind of half a page on my own without looking at the notes. And of course I'm going to forget this over time, but if we consider the Ebbinghaus curve of forgetting, which basically says that the first time you consider something, you'll retain about 30% of it. Then after a day, if you revisit it, you'll retain about 50%. After another 3 or 4 days, about 70%. And then after another week, 90%, and about roughly 100% after a revisitation another kind of 2 weeks later. Basically the key to this is that I'm building up chunks of information and I'll build up those chunks within the structure that I've got in my notes, which is really key, under those titles, so I can think, I've got the title, which if you like is the condensed version of then the whole of that information chunk, which I can then reproduce on the basis of my keywords, on the basis of my highlighting. Once I kind of manage to do that for maybe the whole of that page and the half page after it, I'll then move on to the next section and I'll try and do that. And then I'll stop doing that and I'll move on to something else for the rest of the day. I'll then come back to that the following day, quickly at the start of the day, and see if I can remember just that page and a half, or with a little bit of prompting, then the following day. And again here now, I'll be kind of starring, asterisking anything that I find particularly hard to remember. I might circle it in red if I find it particularly hard to remember, so that I really focus on trying to memorize that the following day or a few days later when I revisit it. But you get the idea that I'm really building up basically towards being able to say everything back to myself from these notes, all kind of, I don't know, probably about 80 pages of them, to myself without any prompting, on the basis of having those titles under which I have chunks of information split up into my keywords that are highlighted and cases, etc. And basically that's how I memorize, and I'll then maybe practice kind of manipulating those chunks of information into an essay plan as my exam gets really close. But basically, just to recap really quickly at the end of this video, essentially I'm making notes. Those notes are condensed. Those notes are well structured, and that's really crucial. Make sure your notes are well structured in the sort of way that you'll want to use them in the exam. Then step 2, I am highlighting and I'm annotating to make connections between the different chunks of information, highlighting in order to condense, and color coding to make things easier to remember. And I'm connecting ideas so that I can have those different chunks of information and use them in different kind of possible essays that could come up. And finally, I'm memorizing by talking to myself, active recall, testing myself on those chunks of information, going through and building bullet point, memorize those, bullet point, memorize those, then try and recall the whole of those 4 bullet points, and doing that with titles that help me memorize different chunks, and basically building up to the point where I can pretty much visualize each and every page of my notes, and I can recall the chunks of information from those in an effective kind of manner in the exam. So I hope you found this video really, really helpful. Please do check out my other videos. I'll link to another video right now, so please do check that out if you found this one helpful. And please do subscribe to my channel and like this video. Share it with anyone you think might find it helpful. And thank you so much for watching. Thanks. Bye-bye.